So I'm going to show a workflow for syncing of design and development theming in a way that's efficient and more maintainable. Before I dive into the specifics of the theming workflow, I wanted to briefly go over the different color spaces that are available to us. Starting with hexadecimals, these 6-digit values. This has been the norm for years. Most designers and developers are accustomed to dealing with hex values. The biggest problem with hex values is that they can be hard to manipulate and work around. For example, we can't confidently rely that changing these digits will result in the expected behavior that we want. It's also hard to know if our color values are tied together in any meaningful way, as they're changing drastically from one to the other. So moving away from hex values, we have RGBA, which of course stands for red, green, blue, and alpha transparency. When 4 of these separate values are placed together, it creates the color that we need. This is a little bit better, but it's still kind of difficult to wrap your head around when making new colors, how changing these will impact the actual color. Now comes the color space that we will use to leverage these workflow improvements. That is the HSBA or HSLA color spaces. Now, HSBA stands for hue, saturation, brightness, and alpha transparency. And if it was the HSLA color space, the L would replace the B and it would just stand for lightness. There are some differences in the way that these two color spaces handle tinting with white or shading with black, but for all intensive purposes, it doesn't affect our workflow. So let me briefly explain how HSLA differs from the other color spaces and how much easier it is to work with. So starting with H, we have our hue value, and this is the actual color that we would select if presented with a color wheel. It begins from 0, and it goes all the way up to 360 degrees, allowing us to essentially rotate through all the color values in the spectrum. I'm going to undo. Then when we get to the S, that stands for saturation, which is the amount, the intensity of the color, and you'll notice that the scale actually goes from 0 to 100 and actually acts as a modifier to the base hue value that we have previously selected. And you can see that I can go in here and just kind of manipulate the saturation along the x-axis and then the brightness along the y-axis while staying on the same hue value, the original hue value I've selected. So why this is kind of a big deal is because we finally have a clear representation of a color, the hue, that can take on modifiers to create additional variations of that base color. So as I'm clicking around, you're going to see that even though the saturation and brightness values are changing, the hue is staying exactly the same at 241. Bringing this back into the workflow, what this means is that when we're creating a new brand or theme palette for our product, we can choose a combination of, say, 4 different hues to represent our brand. So I pick these at random, and I just call them primary, secondary, alternate, and accent. Now with those four colors selected, to save some time, I have added them to the swatches in my library that then I can use to apply color to the different parts of the layout. So for example, if I wanted this to be primary, and this to be primary as well, but I'm actually going to make this primary a slightly different variation of the base primary color. I'm going to add some saturation and some brightness to that. I can go in here and I can give this an alternate color, and these 3 I'll just go ahead and make them all accents, but I'll tweak these as well, and add and remove some color here and there. And maybe over here I'll make this secondary color. And I think that's good. So imagine this was an actual web app and the team decided that we needed to change the brand colors or provide multiple themes for users to be able to select. If our design was already finished or polished, and if all the layer colors had been manually selected by a designer, he or she would have to go through and update every single layer across all the artboards to swap out a theme. This is actually very time consuming, and the same would be true of the front end. Well, because all of the colors on our design are actually tied to the 4 brand colors we have selected initially, we know that all the layers share the same hue values. So to avoid having to replace all the colors manually in collaboration with another developer, we created this plugin that loops through all the layers in the design document and changes only the hue values that match the layer that we have selected. So that's kind of a mouthful, and I think it's easier if I show you. If I click on primary and I do replace hue, say that I change this to green, you're going to see that all of the layers that had a matching hue got replaced with a new color, the new hue. And I'll go ahead and do the same thing for accent, and I'm going to say I want to replace the accent color with purple. So what you just saw was that these three items inherited the purple hue, but that the modifiers of the saturation and the lightness stayed intact. So all of the tinting and the shading and saturation, desaturation properties that we had in our initial layers is still there. So I hope you get the gist of it. With this approach, we can very quickly swap out 4 color values and apply a brand new theme for the entire design document. But more importantly, where this becomes useful is that we can actually apply this exact workflow for our front end as well. So let me go ahead and undo that real quick. Okay. Over here, we have our project settings.scss file, which contains the global styling for our entire project. The first thing that I've done is I went ahead and grabbed all the different hex values from these 4 brand colors and gave them a variable name. Then I assigned that name to our brand's primary, secondary, alternate, and accent variables, as you see right here. So if I ever want to make a change to the primary color, I can go ahead and either replace this variable or replace this other variable up here with a different hex value. And the way that we would use this is just something like div background primary, and this would be pointing to that Regal blue. Pretty straightforward. That's how most everybody uses the variables in preprocessor. But when things get a little bit more exciting is when we try to leverage the same technique I showed earlier. For example, say we're creating a footer text color variable, and we want it to be slightly different tint of the primary color. What we can do is reference the global primary variable, extract the hue by passing this function, and wrap that inside of the HSL function that will return a variation of primary with a saturation of 52 and a lightness of 90. So this would be a different color than what we have up in here of Regal blue, or in this case, this hex value. So what we have just done is establish a relationship between the footer text color and the brand color without having to track 2 separate variables or color values in the style sheet. And like I said, if you later want to go and change this value, you can be confident that it will be inherited and applied properly at the footer text color. So that's pretty cool, but let's talk a little bit about the handoff process. One of the ways that this workflow becomes seamless is through the use of a tool like Avocode. Avocode is a tool that lets a designer upload designs, and a developer can extract the necessary assets and styling so as to not spend time guessing what the correct properties are. So let me show you what that looks like. This is Avocode, and we went ahead and loaded this very basic version of the design. I'm going to go ahead and sync this up. So I'm going to send this to Avocode with the new colors. It's going to take a little bit. Okay, so now if we go back to the project and we sync, now you see that the colors are there. And just a little longer. Okay, so what this tool allows us to do is kind of click around, and we can see the width and the height and different background colors, and we can export assets like this SVG graphic. And it's a helpful tool for just extracting assets and extracting styles from the designs. So where this becomes useful is that we can take the HSL value and actually create a variable that supports a regex or just a regular text replacement. And if the designer can provide the developer with a very basic 4-color mapping that tells the developer what hue is tied to the variable in the code, then this becomes very seamless. So for example, let's click on this guy right here, and we see that there's a background color and the hue is 214. So we know that 214 is primary. We know that that hue stands for the primary brand color. We can then say replace text every time we encounter 214, comma, go ahead and replace that with primary. And when you create the replacement, you're going to see now that this is background color HSL primary 5430. Let's take that one step further though and go ahead and add in the hue function so as to extract the hue out of primary before feeding that into the HSL function. So now we have something that can be copied and pasted to the style sheet without having to really think of it or keep track of the different variables or the colors or the numbers. And if in the future I decide, say that primary actually should be, I don't know, let's change it to green. Then I can go ahead and sync this up to Avocode and provide the developer with the new hue value of 120 as primary, which then he can go and replace inside of this function here and say 120 is actually primary. But we're not going to do that right now. For the last thing that I want to show you, and I won't go too much into detail in this video, but here's a way that we might quickly generate multiple themes by only swapping out 4 variables in our style sheet. Let's take a look at this right here. So in Sass, I don't know if you noticed, but there's this notion of a default value. You can assign to variables if they aren't already assigned by adding the default flag to the end of a value. This means that if the variable has already been assigned, it won't be reassigned, but if it doesn't have a value yet, it will be given one. So that's kind of a mouthful as well and a little bit confusing. So let me show you what that means. Here we are again in our settings.scss file. And the way Sass inheritance works with this flag is that we can load the parent settings.scss file. This would be the parent settings file, but override individual variables like these as needed. So if I open up the settings.scss file of a child theme, we can then say that primary is actually going to be medium gray instead of being regal blue. And so I'm only overriding 4 properties here, and the rest of all the styles gets inherited. And so by writing just a gulp task that loops through all of the different styles, we can essentially generate 5 different themes, and the only thing that you have to do is swap out 4 variables. So that gives us a really easy way of essentially offering multiple themes for users, making our style sheets maintainable. And how this might look like on the programming side is you might have something like this on the website. Here we have our primary, our secondary, alternate, and accent colors, and these are some additional ones I haven't mentioned, but that would be like success, warning, and failure. So we have here our Blue 7 style sheet, and when I'm clicking on this button, there's just a little bit of JavaScript code that is swapping out the style sheets in the head section of the site. But as you see that the mappings are true and they work without having to do any HTML changes, without having to really duplicate style sheets, And of course, we have the variations. Like in this example, we have tinted variations of all of these colors. And then we have shaded variations, so they're darker. Strong variations that provide additional saturation, and then less saturated versions and transparent versions. So we can do that with just the 4 base colors that we selected for the brand, and we can swap those out per theme, and we'll be able to quickly generate themes by only changing 4 variables per file.